No one is truly free if they still live in fear of their own mind. I realized that one morning that seemed ordinary. Sunlight streamed through the window. The coffee cup was still warm on the table, and I sat there, motionless. Not because I had nothing to do, but because there were too many things I was afraid to start. Small things, like making a phone call, sending an email, stepping outside. None of them were dangerous. None could harm me, yet inside they felt like threats. I did not know when the world became so wide, and I became so small. Every decision was measured by an invisible scale. What if I fail? What if I get rejected? What if someone sees that I am not good enough? People often say fear is instinct. It helps us survive, keeps us away from what could hurt us. Perhaps that is true, but few talk about how that very instinct, when amplified and prolonged, becomes a chain. The fear that once saved us now traps us inside a delicate cage, the cage of anticipation, of imagined scenarios, of the quiet voice that whispers whenever we try to change something. I remember reading somewhere that fear is the prison of the heart. When we live in fear, we no longer know what it means to love. We no longer remember what dreams look like. Fear does not always appear clearly. It hides behind reasonable decisions and wise words. We say, "I need more time." But deep down we mean, "I am afraid to do it wrong." We say, "I am fine where I am." But deep down we mean, "I am afraid to lose my sense of safety." Fear is smarter than we think. It disguises itself as logic, even convinces us that avoidance is the right choice. The older we get, the more sophisticated fear becomes, less dramatic, but more deeply rooted in every corner of life. I used to think only weak people were afraid. But then I met those who were successful, strong, and brave, and I realized they were afraid too. They just did not let fear take the wheel. A friend of mine, once a mountain climber, told me he always felt fear before every climb, even after hundreds of ascents. "Fear is good," he said. "It reminds me to be careful. But if I just stand there and wait until I am no longer afraid, I will never climb." I understood then. The point is not to eliminate fear, but to learn how to walk with it. But why is it so hard? Because fear is not just a fleeting emotion. It is wired into the brain from the time humans lived in the wild. The amygdala, the part of the brain that triggers fear, once helped our ancestors recognize danger. A sound in the bushes, a shadow in the distance, traces of a predator. But now the world has changed. No more lions, no more hunters. Only modern fears remain. An unsent email, an upcoming interview, the gaze of others. Yet our brain still reacts as if life were in danger. A single rejection can make our heart race, as if we were facing a tiger in the forest. The irony is that part of the brain does not distinguish between real danger and imagined danger. It only reacts to feelings. So whenever we imagine the worst, the body responds immediately. The heartbeat quickens, the breath shortens, the hands turn cold. We have not done anything, but the body is already fighting an invisible enemy. And so we live in an imagined battle, exhausted, drained, but without any real victory. There was a time I thought that being positive would make fear disappear. But the truth was harsher. Fear does not fade because we ignore it. On the contrary, it grows in silence. Like a hidden wound, the more we hide it, the more it festers. The more we pretend to be strong, the deeper fear seeps into our sleep and our smallest decisions. It keeps us from loving, from daring, from dreaming big. And then we justify ourselves. I am just being realistic. But is it realism or fear? Sometimes we can no longer tell the difference. The world is not as frightening as we imagine. It is our mind that makes it so. Try to recall the last time you did something that scared you, but you did it anyway. Maybe you spoke your truth, tried something new, or simply said no to what no longer felt right. In that moment, did you feel more alive? The fear was still there, but behind it was freedom. A quiet belief that you had just touched an old boundary of yourself. Maybe what makes us suffer is not fear itself, but our resistance to it. We fight it, avoid it, suppress it, and that only makes it cling tighter. Fear is like a child standing at the door. The more we lock it out, the harder it knocks. The only way to find peace is not to push it away, but to open the door, invite it in, look it in the eye, and say, "I see you." Because once it is seen, fear begins to melt. But it is not easy to do that. We are taught to control, to be rational, to suppress emotions. Few are taught how to sit with fear, how to listen to it. That is why so many people live with a quiet trembling inside, even while they appear calm and successful. There are nights we wake up not because of noise, but because of a small question. If I keep living like this, am I missing something? I remember the first time I truly faced that question. It was not a dramatic moment, but an ordinary day when I realized I had turned down an opportunity simply because I was afraid. No one forced me. No one stopped me. I had closed the door myself. And in the silence that followed, I heard the voice of fear. It did not scream. It whispered softly, "I am here to protect you." It was not evil. It simply did not know that I had grown. From that moment, I understood. Fear is not the enemy. It is a heritage. It comes from the lives before us, from those who had to run to survive, who had to stay alert to live. But now we no longer need to run. We only need to learn to stand still, to breathe, and to look at the world with new eyes, where fear is no longer a closed door, but an invitation to step deeper into ourselves. And perhaps true freedom begins the moment we dare to step through that door. Even just one small step, even when our heart is trembling, even when our breath is quick. Because in that moment, we are no longer driven by fear. We are learning to walk with it. There are nights when I sit alone in a dimly lit room, the yellow light falling softly on the table, and I begin to realize that fear has never truly left. It only changes shape, hides behind choices that seem wise. Like an old friend, it knows every wound inside me, every small memory that can make me hesitate. And strangely, I start to see that I am not only afraid of failure, but also of happiness. Afraid that if I truly get what I want, I will lose it. Afraid that if I step into joy, pain will be waiting at the end of the road. The nature of fear is a reaction to the unknown. We are born with a sense of unease about the future. The brain cannot stand the emptiness of uncertainty. It needs an answer, even a bad one. So when we do not know what will happen, we imagine the worst. The brain is trying to protect us, but the way it does that only brings us suffering. It creates tragic stories so we can be ready. But in return, we spend our lives living inside stories that never happened. I still remember the first time I had to speak in public. The whole week before that day, I could barely sleep. In my mind, I saw myself forgetting the words, saw the audience laughing, saw the look of disappointment. I had not even stepped onto the stage, but I had already failed 100 times in my imagination. When I finally held the microphone, my hands shook, my heart pounded, and then nothing terrible happened. No one laughed, no one judged. Some even smiled in encouragement. All the nightmares I had lived through that week vanished in seconds. In that moment, I realized most fear does not exist in the real world, but in the stories we tell ourselves. Seneca once said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." That line, which sounds like ancient philosophy, is actually the raw truth of our modern lives. Fear is not a reaction to real danger, but to the story we believe. A story that might sound simple, like, if I fail, people will laugh. Or more subtle, if I do what I want, I will disappoint someone. But in every form, fear is just the whisper of the mind trying to keep us safe. When we live too long in fear, the mind begins to weave a false world where every new thing equals danger. It flashes warnings, red lights before every step we take. We believe those signals, so we never walk far. That is why people can live their entire lives in their comfort zones, walking only familiar paths, speaking safe words, and smiling at dreams they never touch. But if we look closely, fear is not only a gatekeeper, it is also a mirror. Every time we feel fear, something inside us is asking to be seen. The fear of rejection often comes from the wound of being abandoned. The fear of failure often grows from the memory of old shame. The fear of loss often rises from the pain of losing someone we loved. In some way, fear is showing us the path back to healing ourselves. But most of us are too impatient to listen. We just want it to go away, to be silent, so we can have peace. Yet true peace does not come from silencing fear. It comes from understanding why it is speaking. A friend once asked me, "Why do you always think things will go wrong? Don't you see you are making yourself suffer?" I laughed because I knew he was right. I was not only afraid of bad things, I was addicted to fear itself. It made me feel like I still had control. There is a strange sense of safety in worrying, because when we worry, we feel like we are doing something to protect ourselves. But in truth, we are just spinning in the same circle. Imagine, fear, avoid, regret, and then imagine again. More and more, I begin to realize that fear has its own language. It does not shout, it whispers. Don't do it, you will be embarrassed. Don't speak, they will leave. Don't try, you will fail. These sentences repeat so many times that we start to believe they are our own voice. But they are not. They are echoes of old wounds playing back again. A teacher's harsh words, a loved one walking away, a time we were laughed at, all blending together into the voice of fear. And then we grow up, carrying it as if it were part of who we are. If there was a moment that woke me up, it was when I watched a little boy learning to ride a bicycle. He trembled, his feet pedaling slowly, eyes filled with both excitement and fear. His father stood beside him, holding the seat gently. "Are you afraid of falling?" he asked. The boy nodded. "That's all right. Fall, and you will learn to balance. Just that simple." A few minutes later, the boy fell, cried a little, then got up and tried again. In that moment, I saw something profound. Fear never disappears, but we can learn to live with it until it becomes part of our rhythm. We forget that most of the skills, achievements, and even the most precious relationships in our lives come from daring to move through that first fear. Was your first kiss trembling? Yes, but you did it. Was your first interview nerve-wracking? Yes, but you went anyway. Fear never truly stops us if we listen to it as a reminder. Move slower, but don't stop. What makes fear dangerous is not fear itself, but how we react to it. If we run, it grows. If we fight it with contempt, it resists. But if we simply observe, breathe with it, we will see it is not as frightening as it seems. Fear does not kill us. Only the stories we cling to can do that. This world, after all, is not a scary place. It is a mirror reflecting our inner mind. If we are filled with anxiety, we will see danger everywhere. If we are calm inside, the world softens too. Whenever you feel afraid, try asking yourself, what am I imagining? And is it real? That simple question can be the first key to opening the door. Maybe fear was never the enemy. It is simply the most ancient part of us, trying to protect us from old wounds. But when we are mature enough to understand, we can smile and say, "Thank you. I don't need protection anymore." Then fear is no longer a prison, but a companion, a friend that reminds us to be careful, but never stops us from living fully. And perhaps the real journey begins the moment we dare to look into our fear, not to defeat it, but to understand what it is trying to tell us about who we are. I began to realize something simple that I had never understood before. Fear does not disappear when we run from it. It softens when we face it. Like turning on a light in a dark room, the shadows are no longer frightening. They are still there, but now we can see their shape. In the same way, when we stop and observe fear as a part of ourselves, it begins to change. It is no longer a monster in the dark, but a trembling child that just wants to be seen. And when I learned to look at fear with that kind of gentleness and patience, something strange happened. It began to speak. It told me that I feared failure, not because of failure itself, but because of the shame that came with it. It told me that I feared rejection, not because of others, but because I once believed I was not enough. It told me that I feared change, not because of the new, but because I never believed I was strong enough to handle uncertainty. These whispers came slowly, sometimes in the night, sometimes in silence, and I understood that fear is a reminder that something inside us still needs healing. From that moment, I began to change the way I spoke to myself. Instead of asking, "How do I stop being afraid?" I asked, "What is this fear trying to teach me?" And that small question opened an entirely different path. When I feared failure, I learned about resilience. When I feared abandonment, I learned about my own worth. When I feared loss, I learned to love fully in the present. Every fear is a doorway, and if we are brave enough to step through, there is always a gift on the other side. People often say, "Don't be afraid, be brave." But the truth is, courage is not the absence of fear. It is walking forward with it. Every step, no matter how shaky, is a small victory. You don't need to shout affirmations. You don't need to pretend to be strong. You just need to be honest with your feelings. Admit that you are afraid, but choose to move anyway. That is courage. And each time you do that, you are teaching your mind a new lesson. I can be afraid and still live. It is fascinating how changing the way I name fear also changed my experience of it. My body still reacts the same way, heart racing, hands cold, breath quickening, but the meaning is no longer the same. Before, I called it panic. Now, I call it excitement. When I have to speak in front of people, I tell myself, it's all right. This is energy, not danger, just a small shift in words, yet the whole body responds differently. The line between fear and excitement is thinner than I ever thought. From that awareness, I began to try something new. Each time fear appeared, I no longer ran away. I invited it in, like a guest. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and asked, "What do you want?" Sometimes the answer was silence. Sometimes it showed me an old memory, my father's disappointed gaze, a teacher's disapproving shake of the head, or a moment I was laughed at in class. I sat there, letting those images pass like an old film, without judgment. And slowly, I understood. Fear does not ask me to defeat it, only to listen. There is something else interesting. Fear does not like the light of sharing. When we hide it, it grows in the dark. But when we dare to speak it with a friend, a loved one, or even on paper, it weakens. I used to think that sharing my fear was a sign of weakness. Now I know it is an act of strength. Because only when we dare to reveal our vulnerability can we begin to truly connect. Fear separates us from the world. Honesty brings us back. If you are hearing this, maybe you have also found yourself in nameless fears. Maybe it is the fear of being misunderstood, being left behind, or never being good enough. If so, let me tell you this: you are not alone. We all carry a piece of that inside us. And sometimes, simply saying it, simply admitting, "I am afraid too," is enough to begin healing. So if this story touches you, don't hesitate to share it, or leave a thought, a feeling. You may help someone realize they are not alone either. I slowly understood that what we need is not a world without fear, but a world where fear is understood and placed where it belongs. Fear does not disappear, but when seen through the light of awareness, it becomes a teacher. It teaches us humility, teaches us courage, teaches us that life truly begins when we stop trying to control everything. And in the quiet nights, when fear softly knocks again, I no longer rush to push it away. I simply smile and say, "I see you." Strangely, that single sentence is enough to calm my heart. Maybe what makes us suffer is not fear itself, but believing that we shouldn't feel it. When we accept it as a natural part of life, it loses its power. Like darkness, when looked at with open eyes, it turns out to be only a pause in the light. Since then, every day I learn to live slower, to observe more closely. Each time fear rises, I no longer ask, "How do I escape it?" But instead, "What is it asking me to hear?" And often, the answer is gentle, just a reminder that I am reaching a new edge of myself. In that way, fear is no longer a wall, but a sign of expansion. A quiet voice from within saying, "Step a little further." Beyond this, there is a part of you you have not yet met. And so, for the first time, I began to feel grateful for fear. Because it is fear, more than anything else, that has shown me the way back to myself. One morning, I woke up with that familiar heaviness. On my desk lay the to-do list I had written 3 days earlier. It was still there, not a single line crossed out. I looked at the paper and realized it wasn't time I was lacking. It was fear. Fear of starting. Fear of doing it wrong. Fear of not being good enough. That feeling slipped into every action, making even the smallest task feel enormous. I had spent the whole week living in my head, imagining every possible bad scenario. And I understood that if I kept waiting until I wasn't afraid, I would never begin. People say, action is the antidote to fear. I never believed that until I tried doing very small things. A phone call, a single sentence, one step out of my comfort zone. Each small action, though it seemed meaningless, made fear shrink a little. It turns out, we don't need to be completely brave to start. We just need a little courage to move while the heart is still trembling. And that trembling is the sign that we are truly alive. I remember the first time I tried what I later called walking with fear. Not fighting it, not resisting it, but walking with it. That day, I had to meet someone who always made me feel less than enough. In my head, dozens of thoughts collided. They'll think I'm foolish. I'm not smart enough to talk to them. But this time, I didn't try to chase those thoughts away. I just told myself, all right, you're afraid, and you're still going. I let fear walk into the room with me, sit quietly by my side. And strangely, when I stopped running, it no longer needed to scream for attention. I started reading about something called exposure therapy. The idea is simple. Each time we face what we fear, even in small doses, we are teaching the brain a new lesson, that we can survive. That fear does not mean danger. Each time we face it, an old neural pathway, the one tied to panic, weakens a bit. Gradually, the brain learns not to overreact. It can start with ordinary things, sending an email, talking to a stranger, speaking up in a meeting. These small actions are the practice of freedom. No one is born brave. Courage is built from very small steps, repeated again and again, until the mind learns, I can. I used to think confidence was something people were born with, but now I know it is the result of training little by little, day by day. Not one shining moment of transformation, but a series of times we choose to move forward even while afraid. Each time we do, we reclaim a small piece of our lost freedom. But action doesn't mean forcing yourself. It's not about just getting things done. It's about acting with presence. Once, I had to speak in front of a new group of people. Before walking in, I stopped for a few seconds, took a deep breath, felt my heartbeat, my cold hands. I whispered, all right, fear, I know you're here. Let's go together. That was all. And the talk went smoother than I imagined. I wasn't perfect, but I was real. And for the first time, I understood that we don't need to defeat fear. We just need not to let it steer us off course. I also realized something deeper. When we take action, fear doesn't vanish, but it changes form. It becomes energy. Like fire, if we fear it and stay away, we remain cold. But if we learn to use it, that same fire becomes warmth and light. Every artist, athlete, speaker, creator, they all know the feeling of a racing heart before stepping on stage. But they don't try to put it out. They transform it into vitality. That trembling is the energy of presence, the pulse of being alive in the moment. A friend once told me a story about learning to swim. He said, at first, I thought I just needed to learn how to hold my breath and kick. But no, the hardest part was learning to trust the water, to trust that it would hold me, not drown me. Fear is the same. When you struggle against it, you sink. When you let go, you float. I kept thinking about that. Freedom doesn't come from eliminating fear, but from changing the way we meet it. So I began to practice every day, choosing one thing that scared me a little and doing it. Just one. Calling someone, writing something honest, saying no when I needed to. Every time, my hands still trembled, but each time, I felt a little different. And then, one day, I realized fear was no longer the enemy. It had become a companion, reminding me that I was on the right path. Because only when we reach the edge, only when our heart begins to race, do we truly know we are alive. If you have ever thought you need to stop being afraid before you start, try reversing it. Start first, and fear will shrink on its own. Confidence doesn't come from positive thinking, but from repeated action taken in the midst of fear. And sometimes, the smallest action, sending a message, taking one step, speaking one honest sentence, is enough to change the course of a life. Eventually, you will see that fear never really disappears, but it stops being a burden. It becomes part of your breath. You will still tremble when you try something new, but within that trembling, there is a strange peace, because now you know you can live with fear and still keep walking. There are days when I realize I am no longer afraid of the same old things. What once kept me awake at night is now only a distant echo, but somewhere along the way, new fears appear, not because I have become weaker, but because I am moving closer to the next edge of who I am. Fear seems to know when we are growing, and it always walks beside us to test if we are ready. I began to understand that fear is not an obstacle, but a signpost. Where fear exists, there is a chance to grow. We often think safety is the destination, but in truth, it is the softest trap. The comfort zone is where we know what will happen, where there is no risk, no change. It feels peaceful there, but also suffocating. Like a familiar room where everything is neatly arranged. Nothing is wrong, yet nothing is new. Then one day, we look out the window, and see the world still moving. While we remain still, we are not in pain, but we are not truly alive either. I think of Joseph Campbell's words, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. The cave we fear most always hides the treasure we long for." I had heard that quote many times, but only through experience did I truly understand it. Each time I stepped into the dark, into the unknown, into the quickened heartbeat, I discovered a part of myself I had never seen before. Sometimes it was strength, sometimes it was peace, and sometimes it was just a quiet realization I have been holding myself prisoner for too long. The world can be divided into 3 zones: the comfort zone, the growth zone, and the panic zone. In the comfort zone, we are stable but stagnant. In the panic zone, we are overwhelmed and unable to learn. But in between, the growth zone, that is where the magic happens. It is where we are afraid but still able to breathe, where we tremble but still move forward, where fear becomes a signal that we are on the right path. I began to realize that instead of avoiding fear, we should learn to move toward it gently, carefully, one step at a time, like climbing a mountain with steady steps. I practiced this by writing down the things I feared, not to judge them, but to see them clearly. I called it my map of fear. On it, I wrote what worried me and asked, what's the worst that could happen? And if it really did happen, what could I do to recover? Surprisingly, once those worst-case scenarios were written down, they lost their power. Before, they were vague and overwhelming. Now they were just words visible, tangible, even crossable. I realized fear loses its grip when we name it. For years, I let my mind write tragic stories. Every time I had a chance, it would whisper, "You'll fail. They'll leave. Everything will fall apart." And I believed it. I lived by those stories as if they were the truth. But really, they were only narratives tales we repeat until we believe they are who we are. When I saw that, I began to rewrite them. Instead of saying, "I'm not good enough," I wrote, "I'm learning." Instead of, "I'll disappoint everyone," I wrote, "I'm trying to become who I want to be." A small shift in language. Yet slowly, the entire world inside me began to change direction. The mind is a brilliant storyteller, but it needs guidance. If we let it write freely, it will always write about fear, because fear is our oldest instinct. But if we take the pen and ask better questions, the story changes. Try asking, what if things go well? Just that one question, and the sky inside your mind changes color. We often speak of positive thinking as a slogan, but what's deeper is flexible thinking, knowing that we have the power to choose which story to believe. There is something else I've learned. Fear grows strongest when we are alone. When we isolate ourselves, negative thoughts echo louder, like sounds bouncing in a cave. But when we talk to someone, share even a simple sentence, "I'm scared," its power fades immediately. Not because the other person gives perfect advice, but because in their eyes, we remember we are not alone. I remember sitting with an old friend one evening. He had gone through a hard time losing his job, a divorce, starting over from nothing. I asked if he had ever felt afraid. He smiled. "Of course," he said. But I realized fear didn't kill me. It only made me catch my breath for a while. Then he looked at me and said slowly, "I think fear is proof that we're still alive. Only the dead feel nothing." His words were simple, but they stayed with me. Maybe fear is life's way of asking, are you ready to truly live? So now, whenever I feel afraid, I no longer try to silence it. I simply ask, if I move through this, who will I become? That question changes everything, because instead of running, I begin to see fear as an invitation to step out of the familiar room and meet myself in a larger form. Perhaps that's why we only truly live when we dare to enter the unknown. There, we have no map, no guarantee, but we have a heartbeat. Every beat whispers, if you are still afraid, it means you are still alive. And maybe living is not about being fearless, but about daring to walk with fear one small step at a time, on the path that fear itself has unknowingly lit. I once thought that the journey to overcome fear was a private battle, a path I had to walk alone. But then I realized that no one truly conquers fear in solitude. Fear is born in silence, and it grows in isolation. When we don't speak it, it finds ways to speak for us through avoidance, through restless nights, through half-hearted choices. Some people live their whole lives that way, never saying out loud that they are afraid. Yet in their eyes, in their voices, you can hear the faint trembling of their soul. And I was once one of them. It wasn't until I began to open up that things started to change. I told a friend about my constant worry, about the fear of being wrong, the fear of being seen as weak. I thought he would laugh or try to give advice, but he just stayed quiet for a moment and said, "Me too." Those two simple words felt like the first breath I had taken in years. In that moment, I understood that sharing fear doesn't make us weaker. It makes us human again. When we dare to speak it, we give others permission to be honest too. And the world, which once felt distant, suddenly feels closer. There is something strange about fear. When we hide it, we feed it. But when we share it, it begins to dissolve. Maybe because fear cannot survive in the light of connection. It lives in isolation, in darkness, in the thought that I'm the only one who feels this way. But when we see someone else trembling too, questioning too, fear loses its power. Like two people holding hands through a storm, the wind still blows, but the loneliness disappears. I think of Rosa Parks, the woman who changed history, with what seemed like a small act, refusing to give up her seat on a bus. People often tell her story as a symbol of courage, but few mention that she was afraid. She knew she could be arrested. She knew she could be hurt. But even in fear, she acted, not because she felt no fear, but because she believed in something greater. Behind her act was not only faith, but community, people standing together for justice. It was that connection that made fear powerless. I realized that courage is not the trait of extraordinary individuals, but the result of deep relationships. When we have someone to lean on, even just one person who believes in us, fear immediately shrinks. We are not built to fight alone. The human brain is wired for connection. We feel safer with others, because deep down, it's an ancient memory. In the tribe we survived, alone we were in danger. Maybe that's why those who live in isolation often fall into anxiety, while those with real friendship and community feel less afraid. I remember one night sitting around a small campfire with a few friends. The wind moved through the trees, and in that flickering golden light, we shared the things that scared us most. No one tried to be strong. One spoke about the fear of losing loved ones, another about the fear of never finding purpose, and I spoke about the fear of never daring to live authentically. We didn't offer advice. We just listened. And somehow, that was enough. I realized that fear fades not because we control it, but because someone can see us even while we tremble. The longer I live, the more I believe that courage is contagious. Like a flame, when it is shared, it doesn't weaken, it grows brighter. One person who dares to speak their truth helps others believe they can do the same. One person who takes a small step beyond their limit opens a path for many more. Courage doesn't begin with grand acts, but with one simple choice: to live honestly in a world that constantly asks us to hide. And when I understood that, I began to see my fear differently. I no longer saw it as a private battle, but as a collective journey. Every person who faces their fear contributes to making the world a little less dark. Because when someone dares to live truthfully, they send out a signal that it is possible. We affect each other more than we realize, in the way we love, the way we fear, and the way we rise again after we fall. Perhaps courage is not silence in the face of fear, but gentleness in connection. When we hold someone's hand literally or through a look, we remind them they are not alone. And we remind ourselves that we are no longer trapped inside our private fear. The world becomes lighter when we walk through it together. Fear will always exist, like the shadow of life itself. But when we have someone to share with, to laugh with, to cry with, that shadow is no longer an abyss, but just a faint trace behind the light. And if one day you feel afraid, remember this somewhere. Someone else is trembling too. If you dare to speak, if you dare to step forward, you might be the one who helps them find their courage again. Because courage, in the end, never belongs to just one person. One day, after going far enough, I realized that fear was no longer outside of me. It no longer carried the shape of other people, of failure, or of judgmental eyes. It lived deeper within myself. The oldest, most subtle fear was not about losing money, being alone, or being rejected. It was the fear of losing myself. Or more precisely, the fear of allowing myself to change. Because change, even for the better, means leaving behind the version of who we once were, the one we knew so well, the one we believed was truly me. I began to ask myself, what lies at the root of every fear? When we peel back the layers, fear of failure, fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough, we finally touch the core. Fear of losing control, fear of death, fear of nothingness. No matter what name we give it, it all leads to the same place, the fear of disappearing. We are afraid of endings, afraid that if we let go, if we stop trying to control everything, it will all fall apart. So we cling to what is familiar, like holding onto the shore while the tide is pulling us away. But the waves do not come to drown us. They come to teach us how to float. I remember standing by the sea one cold, salty morning, watching a small child play with his father. Each time the waves came in, the child screamed in fear and ran back, while the father laughed and said, "Don't run, jump in with it." The boy looked at him, hesitated, then tried. He screamed again, got soaked, and then burst out laughing. In that laughter, I heard something simple. And true freedom doesn't come from avoiding the waves, but from learning to move with them. I began to see fear in that same way, not as an enemy, but as a wave. The stronger the wave, the more something inside us is trying to change. Every time I felt afraid, instead of asking, "How can I get rid of this?" I started asking, "What part of me is trembling right now?" The answer rarely came from logic, but from a quiet feeling, a child within me, once left behind, afraid of being forgotten, a memory rising to the surface. When I sat still, breathed slowly, and looked at that feeling without judgment, it softened. No need to analyze or explain. Just stay with it, as you would stay beside a friend who is crying. That was when I discovered something important. We don't need to overcome fear. We just need to walk through it. Because on the other side is not a different person, it is our truest self. Each time we face fear, we don't only leave fear behind, we shed a layer of pretense, the layer that tries to appear strong, that says I'm fine when we're not. When that shell falls away, what remains is stillness. Not because fear is gone, but because we no longer need to hide. I began to practice something small that changed everything. When fear arose, I stopped and named it. This is fear. That's all. I noticed how it felt in my body, a heat in my chest, a knot in my throat, a chill in my hands. I let it be there without pushing it away. When we name fear, we separate ourselves from it. We become the observer, not the one being swept away. And in that simple awareness, something shifts. Fear begins to fade. Like smoke, once seen, it loses its weight. I once read that mindfulness can calm the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear. But what convinced me wasn't the science, it was the feeling. When I paused, breathed, and said to myself, "Everything is okay right now," my body truly settled. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in charge. It became a visitor passing through, and I understood that I didn't need to control fear. Simply recognizing it was enough to dissolve half its power. Courage, I realized, isn't a possession, it's a muscle. And that muscle only grows when we use it. Every small action, every time we step across a boundary, speaking up, saying no, admitting I don't know, is a way of strengthening that muscle. Nelson Mandela once said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. But to me, courage is accepting that fear will always be there and choosing to move anyway. One day, looking back on my journey, I realized that fear was no longer something I wanted to eliminate. It had become a mirror showing me who I was becoming. Each time I felt afraid, I knew I was getting closer to something important. Each time my heart raced, I knew I was touching something real. And perhaps, the purpose of fear was never to stop us, but to wake us, to make us live more consciously, more deeply, more truthfully. Fear, after all, is not darkness. It is the light shining on the places we've never dared to look. When we are brave enough to open our eyes in that darkness, we don't just see fear, we see ourselves, breathing, living, growing. And in that moment, we understand, true freedom is not the absence of fear, but knowing we can still love, still trust, and still walk forward, even while fear walks beside us. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.